Thank you for being here. We're going to talk all about analytics. Kevin, who's our CTO, is here to talk about some really interesting things related to Google Analytics and Google Analytics 4 and revenue tracking and all that stuff. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But first, a few housekeeping things. Number one, the most popular question that we ever get is, are we recording this webinar and will you send it to me? And the answer is always a resounding yes. And we will send it to you around 5 p.m. Central Time tonight. Takes a minute to process the recording and get you all the links, get the page put up. We will send you a recording so you can watch this back, share it with colleagues, share it with peers, or if you have to step away to run to the restroom or something comes up, you can watch whatever you missed later. Number two, we will also send you a link to the slide deck and some other resources that we mentioned throughout the webinar today. And then number three, we do have time for Q&A. So write down your best analytics and tracking questions, or even anything related to nonprofit technology. And Kevin will do his best to provide some answers for you. If you have an idea or a thought or a question that comes up throughout the presentation, feel free to put that in the Zoom Q&A tool, and we'll watch those as they come in, and again, have some time at the end to answer those questions for you. Also, just announced about 2 weeks ago now, we are going to be in person for this year's Nonprofit Innovation and Optimization Summit. Coming up at the end of September, so still plenty of time for vaccines to roll out and all that stuff. We're crossing our fingers and hoping for that, so that we can be in person again for 2 days, 16 plus speakers, both from nonprofits and for-profits who have really interesting marketing ideas that can really help us collectively and move the ball forward in terms of online fundraising. In years past, we've had over 600 people in person. Last year, we had thousands of people tuning in online for the virtual summit. You can find out all about this summit, learn more, and get your tickets at neosummit.com. It's N-I-O summit.com. It's not NIO, it's Neo. And right now, you can actually get the super early bird ticket deal, which is 50% off. That lasts until about April 30th, I believe is the deadline. So be sure to start talking about that internally. Get your boss, get your peers, get your colleagues on board, and get your tickets soon before that price goes up. It's going to be a blast. Now, we have Kevin Peters, who is our CTO here. Let me actually mention this first. If you've never been on a Next After Institute webinar before, our mission is to decode what works in online fundraising and equip you and as many other nonprofits and fundraisers as possible with what we've learned can actually lead to more generosity. We do this through a couple different ways, but everything comes back to research. We go out and we conduct these studies where we might donate to 200 organizations and analyze their donation pages, the giving experience, their email communication, and document that. And then in our research lab, we go test these ideas to see what actually works. From those learnings, we produce resources like ebooks and templates and webinars like this. We have podcasts. We also produce online courses, our Neo Summit certification, workshops, things like that to equip you in the best way that we possibly can. So that's what you're getting into today. Everything that you will hear from Kevin is based on real data, real learnings, and real research and A/B testing, not just gut feelings and best practices, but looking to the data to see what works. Now, Kevin, again, is our CTO. Super glad you're here. He has declared this a Google Analytics emergency. Yes. That's the warning light. We're very proud of our warning light today.
Amazon doesn't sell that to everybody.
No, they don't. It's special ordered. All of the $12 we spent.
That's right. They sell it to only the people that buy
it. Kevin, some things about him. He is an Aggie, which if you are also an Aggie, I believe you have to whoop.
I did that.
Okay.
I did it silently because I'm on the mic.
That's great. How are the Aggies doing in the tournament?
The women are doing fantastic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's awesome. Well, congratulations. You know what I'm talking about?
The men are not in it.
Okay.
No, not in it this year.
Some other things you should know about Kevin. He does not consider himself a data scientist, but he does like to dress up as a scientist from time to time. He would like you to know that he does not develop products. Granted, his resume, as you see on the screen, might argue otherwise. And he does not want you to ask him about developing an online social game. So I repeat, do not ask him about developing an online social game. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin, who is wearing the same shirt as he is in the picture on your screen.
I do want to assure everyone watching, I have more than one shirt. I have at least two that I'm aware of. I just forgot that I wore this last time I was on camera. So here we have it. Nathan already alluded to it, but as we go through today, we're going to be digging into Google Analytics, more specifically, some anomalies we're starting to see in the reporting that we do off of Google Analytics. And it's more than, for those that use it, you often probably are looking at what pages are people checking out on my website, where are donations coming from, where are emails coming from. That's interesting. But the anomalies we're seeing are going to start having far greater reach than just knowing what people are looking at on your site. It's going to influence your advertising. It's going to influence where you get your data and where you can actually know the source of truth. So we're going to get into that. I'm going to try to explain any of the more technical aspects of it. What I encourage you is if you have one that I start to lose you or I start to get too technical, pop it into chat. Nathan will stop me along the way so I can explain more thoroughly. I'll try to make this as simple as possible. But before I give the more recent results, and the reason we even called this an emergency webinar, I actually went to Nathan about a month back and said, we've found this big thing and I want to tell everyone about it. Let's get it out there. I want to make sure everyone sees it. It actually all started, I want to give a little bit of the backstory of how we even found the anomaly that we're starting with. So it starts out with this guy. This is Greg. Greg's one of our EVPs here at Next After. He works directly with clients doing everything from cultivation, email file, donor acquisition, upgrade strategies. And he was working with one of the organizations to do a project called email prospecting. For those that aren't familiar with email prospecting, what it is you can rent the email list of another organization. And what we do is we send them an offer. In this case, we were sending an ebook that our client had written to a list that somebody else owned. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can do it based on you pay a certain amount per email. But in this case, we did what was called a rev share. In this case, we had contracted and set up an agreement between the two organizations that for a certain percentage of the dollars raised would go towards the organization sending the email. The reason this works out great for everybody is that it allows our clients to get a guaranteed low risk. They're only going to pay for the money they bring in. They get to keep the donors once they give a gift. And the organization that's sending the email on their behalf is motivated to keep sending and keep raising more dollars because then they get more money out of it too. But a part of this means we have to report back on the revenue raised because it's all part of the revenue share. We had to not only tell the client, we also had to tell the organization because the organization we're renting from was only going to send the emails if they were making money off of it. So Greg had set up projections, had an understanding of how much he wanted to raise. We sent the first few sends out and he went to go check the results. And the results were lower than what he had expected. So he was using Google Analytics and trying to figure out what was going on. Was there something broken in the funnel? And so he dove into the actual donation platform itself and downloaded all the transactions. One thing to know about Greg, he's super detail oriented. And so he downloaded all the transactions, matched it up to Google Analytics, try to figure out what was going on, because what we found was that Greg's Google Analytics was underreporting by about 25%. It was showing 25% less revenue than he had actually raised. This is, by the way, the first time I've ever made a chart that had the words some money and more money as the two designations. But it is what it is. It did anonymize some of this. So it led to one of the more natural questions that he asked on this one, which was, where did my data go? Now, we've always said Google Analytics can't be perfect, but seeing a 25% discrepancy is a problem. So he actually tasked me and my team of developers to do some investigation. And before I get into what we looked at, what we dug into, I thought it'd be helpful to do a quick explanation for how Google Analytics works in general, so you can kind of understand what might have been going on. So for those that know this, it's old hat, bear with me, this will only take a second. All right. The way this works is when a visitor first visits and types in the domain for your website, everything is happening on what's called the client side. It's on their computer. They go request your website. It goes out to your web server. That server is going to then return the files that get viewed on their browser. It says, here's an HTML file, here's a JavaScript file, here's CSS, so you can control how it looks. Then, once it gets the files back, it then does usually what's called a tracking cookie. It basically keeps a reminder so it knows who you are. That way, when you go to the next page, it remembers where you came from, a little bit of information. Cookies are starting to get phased out for privacy reasons, but this is still the primary way that Google works on the first visit. Then if you're tracking to Google Analytics, the next step in the process is to send that information to Google servers. So with that information, I'm then passing along, hi, this is Nathan. Nathan's on my website. He's looking at this page, and it sent it over to the Google Analytics servers for reporting. Now, that was the old way. That's why when you look at your website, you might often see code like this embedded in the site, where it's tagmanager.com/gtag. What that is doing is loading a file from Google and sending basic information about the visitor to Google so that it can track it for us. Because then nowadays, a lot, especially, it's gotten more complex than just putting Google on the page. It also now we've started incorporating things like Google Tag Manager into the mix. And so when your website gets downloaded, it first goes to Google Tag Manager, downloads that, which then tells your browser to go download Google Analytics. It lets us do things like add Facebook tracking, or add maybe DoubleClick, or all these different ad networks or different tracking systems. Then sends to Google. That way, whenever I want to look at Google Analytics is pulling information about my website from Google servers. So does that all kind of make sense in the terms of how things are working?
Just track it with me. I don't see anyone mentioning it in the chat, but
Okay.
if you have a question or want him to re-explain something, feel free to just put in the chat. I'm watching that, and I can jump in and make sure we get some further explanation. I think we're okay for now.
Okay. So based on all this, we're collecting enough information about our website visitors that we can report on what are they looking at, what pages are they going to. We send data like they just downloaded this resource, they just gave a gift. But this connection's not perfect. As you can see here, there's a lot of arrows of things going back and forth, which means there's a lot of places something can go wrong. That's why even Google has said Google Analytics will not be 100% accurate. I tried to find the exact percentage, but there's a handful of different resources you can pull on. One from Conversion Excel, great site, great resources. They point out that data deviation is about 5% is expected, and it's harmless. So we're not using it to report on how much money we raised exactly. We're supposed to use it to report on trends. Another one from Sierra Interactive, perfection isn't the goal. If you have 90 to 95%, you have enough data to work with to figure out where your money's coming from. So in general, we're hoping for 95% level of accuracy. So when Greg showed me that he's missing 25% of his data, that became a big deal. Because if we had used the original number, the list vendors weren't going to send any more emails. That means our client wasn't going to raise any more money. It was, and not only that, it was outperforming what they thought. More people weren't going to get the resource. So we had to figure out that was unacceptable in terms of the data. But the tricky part about Greg's question is it's not as simple as saying, where's my data? It's the best analogy I could think of is the where's Waldo. It's actually the inverse of asking where's Waldo.
I stared at that question, what is the inverse of where's Waldo, for a long time. So I'm excited to see where you go.
Because we're not trying to figure out where Waldo is. The equivalent of what Greg was asking was, I'm missing this big hole of data. Who's missing? Because I can't look and find it. I got to look and see what's not in there, which becomes very difficult in terms of figuring out, because it's not that all traffic was being blocked or the Androids weren't getting through. It was that some percentage, an unknown number, weren't coming in of revenue. We actually tracked it back and we saw it wasn't just that it wasn't reporting. We weren't reporting emails. The email count was off in Google Analytics. And we were able to dig into server logs and figure out the visitor counts were off too. So it was just blocking tracking entirely. So to figure out what was missing, we ended up, to fill in that gap, we started tracking everything we could. So instead of when somebody submitted an email acquisition, they went to a form to request an ebook. Instead of saying, what's your first name, last name, email, we also captured a lot more information. Captured what browser they were using. What device are they on? Are they mobile or the desktop? Is it Android? What version of Android? What operating system? Windows, Linux, iOS. Captured screen resolution. And then we tried to capture as much on capabilities as possible. Do they accept cookies or not? Are they blocking our advertising? Things like that. And then not only did we capture the information about the person, we then tracked two key factors. Were our tags enabled, meaning able to download Google Tag Manager. Separately, we tracked those. And then we tracked, could we actually talk to them? Because being able to download a script and send information to it are two different things in the technology world. And while we were curious about this one organization, we also noticed that it might be more far-reaching than that. So we took this same script, applied it to about 12 pages across 7 different organizations. And we were able to capture over 100,000 different email submissions tracking all of this data. This was only, and I'm going to say this as we go through here, there's a lot of different windows of data. There's a lot of different segments and things we're pulling from. Some of this data is somewhat limited. In this case, we're looking at the last 3 weeks of data to collect this 100,000, but still 100,000 submissions is a pretty significant number of submissions. Based on all that, we put together an interactive dashboard. That's the ugliest thing I've ever put together. But to a data analyst, this is beautiful because it has all your data. I can click on one thing and be able to drill in, and I could analyze what's happening, how many submissions, is it enabled, is it not enabled, all the different things that I care about to try to figure out what was going on. And what you're going to see here is we checked, was Google Analytics enabled, was Google Tag Manager enabled, and then was it successful? What we found in general was that Google Analytics was enabled, Google Tag Manager was enabled, they went kind of hand in hand. Not only that, if it was enabled, it was largely successful for the most part. And we tried not only loading Google Analytics via Tag Manager, we also loaded it directly on the page. I can get into some of the nuances for people that care. We went granular, we tried to test as much of the nuances as we could. So based on all of that, now I'll show you some pretty graphs that are much easier to understand than that terrible ugliness of a table. However, yes and no is much clearer in the way things work. I will send out access to that dashboard for anyone curious that wants to do their own digging and pivoting, if Nathan helps me remember to make that public and anonymize some things that I need to put in there. But first question we asked, which was the most natural question to us, was, are they blocking ads? Ad blocking, privacy has become a bigger deal these days. And one of the things people can add to their browser is an ad blocker, whether through their antivirus software, their own, there's a lot of different options out there. So what we found was if somebody did not have an ad blocker, 92% of those people allowed Google Analytics to come through. If people did have an ad blocker, half of them ended up preventing us from tracking them. When we first saw this, my initial thought was, okay, well, we found a problem. Except when you look at how much of a problem that was. Only 5%, 1 out of 20 visitors had an ad blocker that we could detect on their browser. So you factor that together, half of the people are blocking it, represents 5%. That's only 2%-ish of my people that are missing because of ad blockers. It's not the reason I'm down 25% like Greg was experiencing. So it wasn't that. Then we started looking at the source of traffic. The 3 primary sources in this case were paid social. So we were running ads on Facebook, primarily Instagram as well. Email, and that was from prospecting as well as house file emails with a handful of our clients. And then we also had some paid search traffic that were being driven to it. Paid social had nearly 100% tracking. 100% of the audience coming from paid social was allowing us to track them with Google Analytics. 79% with email. So this is interesting, and we wanted to make sure, again, this wasn't something like a small percentage skewing it. Email was roughly half of representative paid social. They were relatively equal amounts, probably almost identical in amounts if you've taken the fact that email's just not allowed us to track them to 20% of them. So we dug a little bit deeper into each of these 3 segments, and we split it out not only by the channel, but also by device. In this case, desktop is the blue one, mobile then is your pinkish orangish one, and then you have your gray one, which is your tablet. We found paid social is twice as likely to be mobile. This isn't surprising. We see this quite a bit. People get on Facebook when they're on their phones. So as a result, the Facebook mobile advertising is one of the more prominent channels that people come through. Comparatively, email and paid search were far more likely to be desktop. So when we then stopped looking at it by channel and then looked at it instead by the device, all of a sudden things started to click. Mobile was 97% likely to let us track. A tablet was 99%. We were getting 1 out of 4 desktop visitors blocking our traffic if they're visiting our site. 1 out of 4 of our visitors are preventing us from tracking them. That's huge, significant. So looking at desktop only, we kept drilling down. And this is how we like to do our analysis. We'll start at the top, we keep going down. So we looked at the desktop and said, is it just a single instance? Is it one browser on the desktop that's doing it? So that orange line is the number of submissions. You can see there's a pretty decent amount. Chrome is still the #1 browser. It's the #1 browser in the world. Had the majority. Chrome had 1 out of 4 visitors blocking us. Microsoft Edge, one of the more recent versions, had 87%. Firefox, 53% of them let us do that. So you start to look at what the differences between these 4 different solutions are. Chrome and Firefox are heavily able to utilize plugins. Now, Microsoft Edge recently rolled out and is now what's on called Chromium. It's the same thing that Chrome is made out of is now what Edge is made out of, which is the Microsoft. But the key difference between these, and I have a graph that illustrates it, is the age demographic of people using Edge is about 10 years older than the age demographic of someone using Chrome. They're older demographic that doesn't know how to install plugins oftentimes. So it's not that they couldn't, it's that there's not as many people doing it. Now, I don't have definitive proof that it's a plugin that's doing this, because again, we're trying to say what's not in this whole, but this is the key similarity between all these. It might be a plugin. It might be an antivirus software. It's possible that these are using VPN softwares to block certain types of traffic as well.
What's a VPN?
A VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, which is a way of securing communications from my computer. I route it through my office, for an example.
Sure.
And then that office takes me out to the internet, which prevents somebody from listening in on my conversation. There's security risks, like if you use your computer at Starbucks, other people can listen in on the data you're sending back and forth. VPNs, that's not as much, but they can also then block traffic as a result.
Couple.
Yeah. So we noticed this. So what we found was, going back to that, here's how Google Analytics works. What we found was happening was on the client side, they were putting up a big brick wall between not only Google Analytics, but Google Tag Manager. Now, even still, this didn't account for Greg's significant decrease in revenue, because it was part of it, especially with the email prospecting, knowing it was coming from there. But the other thing to note is where money comes from on the web, especially for us nonprofits. What I did on this one is I went to, starting on January 1 through yesterday, went and refreshed the data. I pulled 28 different nonprofit websites that accept donations. And I did the conversion rate for people that show up on the site to giving a gift. And then I based it on the devices. This is a big sample size. We're dealing in, I want to say, 20 or $30 million. And what we ended up finding on this one was that if you see, mobile is half as likely to give a gift as desktop. So the fact that desktop is blocking our tracking means that the people twice as likely to give a gift are the ones blocking our traffic, which means it's exacerbated even more for the e-commerce.
Right.
Putting it another way, doing all the math for you guys, 1 out of 6 donations is not being sent back to Google, is not being sent back to Facebook, is not being sent back to our online tracking software. Now, based upon all of this, we started to ask additional questions, which is, okay, this is a lot, but is this the reality and we just haven't realized it? When did all of this start? So what we then did is I took, again, changing sample sizes. I hate doing this as an analyst. It irks me whenever you're like, but this is the only way we could get to the data that we needed to on this one. But we took 5 different nonprofit organizations, and then we compared their online Google Analytics results with their CRM, the source of record for all nonprofits. We specifically narrowed it down to just one-time gifts, so that wasn't like a recurring donation that wasn't done on Google Analytics, all those different things. So based on all of this, we then said, how accurate was Google Analytics compared to the CRM, which has the real data in it? What we found was in the beginning of, or the end of 2020, calendar year 2020, we were seeing anywhere between 5% to almost perfect in 1 month, which was normal. Again, that's a normal discrepancy. But then what we started to notice is in October, November, we started seeing a decline to where in 2021, we're now down to 80% level of accuracy with these organizations. These organizations, we specifically chose these groups because they have, I think, 4 different donation platforms, 3 different payment providers, 3 different CRM solutions, and a unique Google Analytics setup on each one. So that it isn't just like, oh, this code wasn't done right. All of them were unique in their implementation. All of them showed the same basic trend that we're seeing here, which is we're seeing a 15% decrease in accuracy in reporting just in the last 6 months. It's increasing. And if you think about it and you look in the news, after seeing this, it became like a light bulb of, oh yeah, we're seeing so much more about user privacy that it's just now starting to really kick in our reporting. It always goes back to the John Wanamaker quote, which is, half the money I spent on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half. This was said back when advertising was billboards. I remember seeing this one time. I was like, I know where my money's coming from. I no longer know where my money's coming from anymore. We start running into problems. So based on all of this, it then leads to the more pressing questions of what are the implications of this lack of tracking? So I'll say this. We started going down the rabbit hole of saying, like, is it an individual plugin that's causing this? Is it an individual browser setting? Because a lot of browsers now have the ability to, by default, prevent tracking. But the end result is it doesn't really matter. Because if your user doesn't want you to track them in terms of Google Analytics, we need to honor that request to some degree. And so instead, we need to account for it in the way we do things. So what are the implications? The implications come down to two primary areas of concern that you need to worry about. The first is your reporting, and I just added a handful. I actually got tired of searching for icons. I could have added 100 more icons to the reporting section. And then the advertising, again, this I got a little tired, but those are the two primary, which is Facebook and Google Ads. So I want to hit on the kind of the implications of this. And then we're going to get into what to do about it. So first, I want to go through each of the different reporting and talk a little bit briefly about this to hopefully explain it in ways that people will understand. First off, we'll start off on Google Analytics. So with Google Analytics, because of this blocking and tracking, you're going to continue to see, if we keep the same implementations, to keep the same setups, a reduction in traffic of about 25%. However, that doesn't mean it's not worth looking at. Data should instead be viewed as directional. We can use it for making quick decisions to know, did this email perform versus this email? Because if I send them at the same time, they're both having the same level of blocking happening to them, that we can know that this one performed better than this one. So it's directional. But if you're going to go to your board, if you were going to go to your boss and say, we raised this much money on this campaign, that number should come from the CRM, not from Google Analytics. We use Google Analytics to figure out, did this individual email outperform this one at a directional?
Makes sense.
Okay. Then we can get even further. We get into Google Analytics 4. This one is a more recent push by Google. It's something actually, as a organization, we have been migrating all of our clients to over the past several months. It's where Google is going. Oddly enough, it's not fully baked yet. There's still a lot of features they're working out. There are bugs in it, there are kinks in it. But what we're recommending to people is Google Analytics now, if you go to make a new web property, this is what it makes it. It's where Google's going. It's a completely radical shift in the way it does tracking. However, it's going to suffer from the same lack of tracking as GA4 does, as GA3 does, because it's talking to the same server. Same people are going to block Google Analytics 4 that would block Google Analytics 3. Now, that isn't to say we shouldn't move to it. I'm recommending any organization start, the sooner the better, to double audit to Google Analytics 3 and 4 to build up a base of knowledge in the new one while still using the old one. Not only that, this is where Google is going to be building their new features, because it's been known that tracking is going to become a problem in the future for a while now. It's just I don't think people realized how quickly we got to this point. They're starting to build in algorithms that can project projected results. They're using machine learning to say, I know you tracked 100 gifts based on your users and what is the normal behavior. We think you actually got 120 gifts. And it will report on the projected impact instead of just the actual impact.
Interesting.
Now, that can be more helpful for directional. It's going to be super helpful for advertising, like we're going to see in a second.
Gotcha.
Okay. Over this a little bit. For those, Google Tag Manager is something not required to run your website. But anymore, if you have more than 1 or 2 tags, it's something we highly recommend moving to, because it removes the need to push code to a server. It makes it less likely that something's going to break, and it makes it easier to preview things prior to going live. Now, the downside of Google Tag Manager, though, is it uses the same URL that Google Analytics does. So it appears that the plugins or the VPNs or the browsers that block Google Analytics are also blocking Tag Manager, the web version of Tag Manager. I'm alluding to something I'll talk about here in a second. I'll come back to that.
Can you redefine what Tag Manager is? There was a question just to provide some clarity.
Sure.
As to what does it do? How does it work?
So Google Tag Manager is, it took me a long time to wrap my head around exactly what it does. Yeah. Google Tag Manager is a way for you to add individual, what they call tags, but scripts to run on your website. So I can add Google Analytics to here, and then it deploys it on my website. I can add my Facebook pixel to Google Tag Manager, and it deploys it on my website. And I can do things like when I get to this thank you page, trigger an event that says I acquired their email. Or I can also use it to add my LinkedIn pixel or my, trying to think of other different, there's any different number of events that usually happen with digital advertising. It's usually a lift to get implemented because doesn't add any additional functionality that you don't already have on your website, but it makes maintenance much easier.
Gotcha.
The number of organizations that when we first start with that are using an implementation of Google that's over 8 years old is astounding. That's not to say that it doesn't work, but it doesn't come with the newest features. This lets you stay relevant up to date.
Makes sense. Robert, one of the listeners today, had an interesting metaphor. He basically said, think of it like a beneficial Trojan horse. Trojan horse goes in and then you can deploy whatever you want from it.
That's a great way to put it. Yep. You install this one thing and then it takes care of installing all the other things for you. It's a great way to put it.
It's helpful.
He should, I bet, Robert, can you come up with a better analogy than my Where's Waldo? I felt like that was a stretch.
I liked it. He's
okay.
Good.
Well, we'll see what he comes up with. So, but here's the thing on Google Tag Manager. Highly recommend utilizing it, highly recommend installing it. But in the past, and even us as an agency got into a habit of using it because it was easier than actually implementing code. We've run an experiment and we learned that changing this way on the form gets a 20% lift. We can use Tag Manager to roll that out. Problem with Tag Manager is that it's now being blocked for 25% of my traffic. You can't use it for scripts that provide functionality to your site. So if you want to make sure to have a pop-up on your website, Tag Manager isn't how you would deploy that. You'd use a WordPress plugin or a system like Unbounce that can do it for you. So use it for non-necessary scripts or tracking is what we'd use it for. It just changes the functionality. Google Optimize. Okay, for those that don't know what Google Optimize is, this is, anytime you see these big green arrows with this versus this, and this is the lift, especially on the websites and donation pages, we're using Google Optimize. It's a free A/B testing software given out by Google. Still uses the old GA3 implementation. I think the next version is going to have GA4 as the building blocks. Another reason to move over to that. But the question became, are experiments no longer valid because it's not tracking everything? So simply put, if you're using Google Optimize, either installing it directly on your site or putting it in Tag Manager, it doesn't matter. It's going to, a software that's going to block it is going to block it in either way because both of them reference the same URL. There's a Google URL that's getting blocked. Samples and conversions are going to be blocked the same. What that means is your results are effectively sampled. We get 25% less desktop users to see our experiment, but the distribution of treatment versus control is identical. What that means is if my donation page shows a 25% lift, that's directionally accurate, even for the people that didn't get it. Now, you can start getting the nuances of, well, what about the people that aren't letting you track them? Well, we can't track them anyway. So there's not much we can do crying over spilled milk in that kind of case. But the thought is keep using Google Optimize with the acknowledgement that a certain percentage are blocking it from actually testing it. They still see the regular, it still works as normal. We're just not able to use that to figure out which is a better solution.
Makes sense.
Google Ads. Google made a lot of stuff, by the way. They have a lot of logos out there. Okay. I'm not a Google Ads expert. We actually hired multiple people that are way better at this than me. But because everything goes back to the same Google servers, it's getting blocked too. Now, what this means, this is actually where we start getting to a much more significant impact. Google Analytics, we lose some insights. We don't lose results, the money's still there. Google Ads, we're gonna lose results. Because two things are happening on this one. One, it's gonna undercount reporting. Certain people are blocking it, so we won't be able to use them for reporting. We'll have to figure that out. That's not as big of a concern as a simple fact that Google Ads gets better when it figures out what is working and what is not, who is converting and who is not. Because if they're blocking your Google Ads script like they would be, it's preventing remarketing lists from getting bigger, and it's preventing Google from learning from the prior conversions. Now, the good news on this is, again, Google knew this was coming, and this is actually just the tip of the iceberg because I'm not going to touch on it too much today, but there's some new changes coming in iOS 14 that are going to be rolling out. Facebook is heavily impacted. Google is just as impacted. which people can opt out of tracking on individual sites, which means if they're on an iOS device, we won't be able to remarket to them because they're not allowing us to target them because they're preventing tracking.
Gotcha. The mobile number will likely get
the mobile number is going to go down. It's not to say we can't advertise to them. We just can't target them. I can't upload my list of donors and say, show them this ad or get me people that look like these donors. So it's going to be far less effective in that manner. Now, Google's going heavy into predictive algorithms that can guess who converted.
Right.
It sounds weird.
It does.
It's hard to wrap. It's hard to wrap your mind around. But Skynet's going to tell us whether we were successful in it. That's the key takeaway on that one. Yeah, that day is coming. And then one of the last ones I want to talk about is Facebook and the implications on Facebook. Because the good news on this is right now the biggest shift and change with the Facebook. Because remember, if they're coming off Facebook, especially on mobile, we were getting 99% level of tracking. Now, if they come on desktop and we're using Google Tag Manager to load Facebook, then we're not going to track as many visitors or conversions. So it's not as heavily impacted because it's so much mobile. It's going to report our conversions. It's going to have the same sufferings that Google Ads does. Now, we also, and I want to add this as a caveat, we did not test whether adding the Facebook snippet directly on the page loaded better than using Tag Manager. It may not. My guess is if they're blocking Google Analytics, they're blocking Facebook. They're the two biggest advertisers in the world these days. So the downside of this, though, is I mentioned this is just the cusp. Our results are going to be a little bit lower, especially those visitors that are going on desktop, which is a much smaller percentage. However, in about a month or two, iOS is going to roll out a prompt that whenever you load up your Facebook app, the first time it rolls out, it's going to prompt you with a choice that says, would you like to allow Facebook to track you? I can't think of a single person that's going to be like, yeah, that would be awesome if they did. I wish it said, would you like to be shown relevant ads instead of ads for gold? Because that's actually what they're asking you. I digress. So, but once that rolls out, Facebook is going to start suffering from the same problem that we're seeing with Google Tag Manager, albeit there's a less easy way to solve that problem. The reason I point out and why I talk about remarketing and why I talk about loss of conversions and why that's a big deal, throw in some ads. I actually found an ad from us. Yeah, this feels a little like navel gazing of like, look at what we did. But we did a test for our webinar registration, one with remarketing ads, one without remarketing ads. The with became the control. What we found is when we remarketed to people, when we showed people that had shown a previous interest in ad, we got 44% more emails acquired. Remarketing is a way of targeting people who are showing high affinity. We do this we have a handful of different child sponsorship organizations that we work with, where this is the #1 source of those donors, because once you've got somebody's interest, the hardest thing is to get them to come back and finish the process. Yeah. This is going to be diminished. We've also found, and we've tested this multiple times, that with Facebook and with Google, it shows the same thing. You tell the system what you want. In this case, we did a test of an email registration for a novena with the Missionary Oblates. And we tested, instead of saying, go to this page, sign up for a novena, which is a 9-day email series, and then you get the opportunity to give a gift. Instead of telling Facebook, I want people to sign up for my offer, we told Facebook, I want people who are willing to make an online transaction. The difference, 157% increase in the number of donors. We see this without fail. There's a lot more nuances that go with this too, of like value-based versus conversion-based and all the different little dials you can use with Facebook. But what this is telling us though, is we're not getting as many purchase events back to Facebook, which means it's under-reporting, which, okay, we just go somewhere else, get a reporting. But the other problem is it can't refine its algorithm. Sure. It can't say, I'm telling it, I want these people and I want to purchase. It doesn't know who purchased, so it's not able to get smarter. That becomes a problem. So now I've said a lot of good news, a lot of bad news. Now I'll give you some good news. Email service providers, CRMs, they will not be impacted by this. If I'm submitting a form that gives the data, it's not going to be impacted by somebody blocking Google Analytics because it has to go out to that service and it has to come back for it to work. So that's not near as big of a deal in terms of collecting that actual data as it was. Now, the one caveat, there's MailChimp has this, HubSpot has this, Marketo has this, Pardot has this. If you use a pixel with your email service provider to do triggers, that may be blocked as well. It will be blocked if you're in Tag Manager. In all likelihood, even if you didn't use Tag Manager, it's still going to be blocked. Sure. So the forms will still function. And then like when you're open and click metrics, they're not blocking those from loading. So those will still be somewhat accurate. I'm going to say somewhat accurate because for those that didn't know, when you look in your MailChimp to know how much, what percentage open rate did I have, for those that were unaware of how they came up with that number, what happens is there's actually a little image on the email that gets downloaded that's unique to a person, so that when that image gets downloaded, that tells me that person opened my email because they looked at my images. That's not 100% accurate. Your open rate, despite what MailChimp and Constant Contact everybody tells you, is not 100% accurate, because two things can happen. They can block your images from loading entirely, or it could be a preview pane and just flash quickly, which counts as an open. Still more accurate than what we're getting online. So it's half dozen sticks in the other. Okay, so that was a lot of doom and gloom. I apologize about that. But this is why I wanted to do the emergency webinar. This is why I wanted to get this out there, because without knowing this, you might look to the wrong place for information. So what can we do about this? I'm going to go in order from easiest to probably hardest in terms of implementation. Some of these get very technical, and the first thing you can do is nothing. We can literally do nothing, because a couple things might happen with this. One is Facebook wants you to keep spending money. Google wants you to keep spending money. They're going to come up with ways to improve their own advertising. Now, it may take them a while, and it may never get to the level of accuracy or optimization that we had before. Sure. But if you're a small nonprofit and you're spending $1,000 a month on advertising, the amount of time and effort you would put in to get tracking back to what it was, probably not worth it in the results you're going to get. Because there's still plenty of people at a lower ad spend than at a higher. But even if you are one of the smaller ones, another thing you can do, another option, deals with source codes. Now I'm going to get super nerdy here.
Let's do it. This is my favorite slide in the world.
So CRMs is a single source of truth. If I want to know how much money I raise, I go to my CRM, I run a report, and it says this is the amount of money that came from this marketing code. In theory, I say theory, in theory, that should be the #1 source for information. I've worked with organizations where that isn't right too, but that gets into a whole different problem. The problem is most people are using a baseline source code that doesn't give them the level of depth of knowledge that they could otherwise have. And so one way you can do this is by changing how you track your efforts far more granularly. Let me show you. This is an example one, but I want to break down the way this is kind of set up here as an example. This isn't to say the only way to do it, but I can look at this code and know where that gift came from, when it came at, and to what marketing effort it came from. So we first start off, the first 2 letters are always the fund or the department. Let's say it's a university and it's athletics. AT would be the first 2. I could have MK as marketing. I could have EV as events, whatever the case may be. Then you get into your fiscal year is the next 2. Then you get into the month. And this is, I got to tell you, this is where most people mess up. Always a 2-digit month. Because if you're coding these to auto decode using code, I said the word code 4 times in a sentence. But if I'm doing that, what ends up happening if I'm just using a single digit is it can break the knowing where to look. So we put the month. I now know it's in fiscal year 21 in February for my athletics department. E then becomes the sub channel. Oftentimes we're checking, is it direct mail? Is it online? And that's it. But if you're spending money on advertising, it's important to know the sub channel. I need to know if a Facebook donor is as good as a Google donor, is as good as a remarketing donor, is as good as an email donor, because that tells me where to put my time and effort. I can tell the channel from the sub channel, but it's important to track that sub channel level. And just a single letter is usually going to be it. E, email. F, Facebook. G, Google. All those different things. D, direct mail. It can work on any sub channel. You can also use it as purpose. I know direct mail will track newsletter different than a direct mail letter, different than a prospecting letter. Those are sub-channels within the different channels. And then finally, you get down to your marketing effort. This is just a number from from 1 to 99. Because again, in a given month, I hope you don't have 99 different touch points. That seems excessive. But then this can be tracked back to a single campaign being run on social. If you want to get granular, this can be email 1, my year-end campaign. And then email 2 would be 02. It allows me to track because all the others are going to be unique. That gives me a lot of room to run with this one. And then in your CRM, you just code in there the campaign that 01 equal to this campaign. So again, that got super nerdy if it wasn't nerdy enough. But good tracking is what enables you to have huge growth. And that's something we've come to learn over time. Okay, option number 3, we're getting more and more complex if it wasn't complex enough. This one means aggregating your reporting. Instead of using Google, instead of using Facebook to report on your results, you can pull from your actuals. You can pull from your individual sources of record. And I'm going to give you a couple different tools to check out if you don't have these already. For those that aren't familiar with it, there's one tool that we used to use called Supermetrics, which is fantastic, but it has become fantastically expensive. So there's a new one we've recently found, Aggregating, which is a way that you can connect a Google Sheet, which is free, using Aggregating, which is also free, to Facebook, and it can pull down aggregate data for you. It can tell you how much you've spent on a day, on a campaign, on an individual, so that then you can use Zapier to pull from your gift processing. If you're using Stripe, if you're using authorize.net, Zapier can connect into those, pull those and report those into Google Sheets too. At that point, it's a simple pivot table to match this data with this data. And now I have a set of analytics that are based on actuals, not what is being reported back to the systems and being blocked. Then the optional step in this one becomes Google Data Studio. We're pretty heavy into this one. The reason I use that one, it's free. Google Sheets is free. Aggregating is free. Zapier is like $1 or $2. I don't know. I can't remember last time. It was $5, something like that. It's not very expensive. But this allows you to aggregate your data. It takes a setup time that's a couple hours the first time you do it, but then it's set it and forget it. You go back and you check on your sheet and it tells you what your results are in any given time. And it can get you to something that looks like this, where you can have your spend broken down. This is a Google Sheet report that we used to use for analyzing Facebook funnels on a monthly basis. It would tell us what our spends are, how many impressions, click, emails, transactions, revenue, click-through rate. And this would allow us to look at a month, how are things shifting, how are things doing. Using this, you can then build out even more advanced reporting. Google Data Studio allows you to make these kind of pivots in ways that let you see spend, emails, gifts at a high level across, and then drill down into your individual campaigns. This, I left this for number 3 because again, it's getting more and more complex. But depending on the level of spend you're at, this may make sense. Okay, we're getting deep down into the rabbit hole on this one. A more nuanced and recent advent from Facebook, as they saw this coming. It was within like the same 2 weeks that the iOS 14 change was announced. Facebook announced what they call Facebook Conversions API, which is a way for you to send offline transactions or just every transaction back to Facebook. So that even if they're blocking Google Analytics and Facebook, we can still tell Facebook if they're successful, and it can refine and optimize your ads accordingly. I want to emphasize, this is not worth your time and effort unless you're spending a lot of money on Facebook. But if you are, what it does is it allows it to refine its audience. It allows it dedupes. So if it does get audited, Facebook has a way of figuring out these two are the same gifts and it doesn't double count it. And it allows you to track additional events that you otherwise wouldn't be able to track.
Can you clarify what is a lot of money to be spent on?
I would say if you're not spending round number $10,000 a month, this probably isn't worth the time and effort. Because this is, but now I say that, there are tools that may be worth looking into, like LeadsBridge is a relatively inexpensive tool that allows you to connect your CRM to Facebook and do it directly. If that's the case, if you can do the direct connection, you're great. However, if you're using Razor's Edge, you can't do that. If you're using, I can't think of it. Like Facebook allows for LeadsBridge, or not Facebook, Salesforce allows for LeadsBridge to connect to it. So in that case, it would handle all that for you, which is great.
Yeah.
Save you some time and effort. If you have Stripe, Stripe connects to LeadsBridge, which connects it, and it's relatively low cost that could help supplement it.
Sure.
In that case, it takes the time to implement off the table, which makes it worthwhile. That whole thing, yeah. We're looking at doing that for our clients. It's, my developer's not happy with me right now. But it can be powerful if you're spending at the volume or if it's easy to do for your organization. Option number 5. This is the last option because again, it gets into much, much more granularity on this one. It's called server-side Google Tag Manager. Remember my beautiful icons imagery setup of how Google works and how they're blocking us. Well, what I didn't show you on this one is where things are happening. So everything in this little gray box is if it's yoursite.com. Whatever your organization is, that's all happening within there. It goes to the client side, they request your browser, and then it goes to the server, it puts the cookie, all this is happening within the visitor's browser. Google's then able to block it because I have to reach out to googletagmanager.com and their browser is like, oh, I know what they're doing out there. Nope, puts up that big window. There's a relatively new option available for Google Tag Manager, which is you basically host your own implementation of Google Tag Manager, which is the way it works is you spin up a server within Google Cloud. It costs anywhere from $60 to $100 a month. And $100 is at the millions of visitors per month kind of level. It's not a huge cost. But again, the cost of this is not necessarily the setup, it's the maintenance of it. Because then what you do is because you own that server, you're able to give it a subdomain of your own site, analytics.yoursite.com. The browser is not going to block a call within its own website because those are the things that websites need to function. And so you're able to send information to your Google Tag Manager through what's called the data layer. It then sends it over to Google and the analytics, so it fixes it. Now, the other good things about this server-side GTM is it offers a lot more granular control. We work with one group that's a medical nonprofit. And so they have a lot of sensitive information that they're storing about medical patients. And there's a lot of new laws coming up that may prevent them from sending any of that. Even somebody they're like the first name of someone into Google. And so they need much more granular control of what gets sent off to Google. This would allow them to anonymize that basic information prior to Google getting it. Whereas if it's just in the URL, oftentimes they aren't able to do that as well. So there's some granularity with it. The downside is, this is the more technical one, because it requires server configurations. Initial site, yeah, I mean, it's just a box you put around your website. We're doing this with a handful of organizations, but this doesn't really even apply well to you if you're out of your own control in terms of your server. If your donation page is hosted on classy.org, there's nothing, you can't do that because you're not gonna be able to spin up a Classy server. So there's a lot of limitations, and this is, again, this really gets down to, it's good to do, but this is for the top 1 to 2% of websites need this right now.
That makes sense.
So if that wasn't technical enough, oh, we're done. That was it.
I didn't see option 6. I don't know.
There is no option 6. That's as technical as I want to get. But
wow.
Okay. Thank you, everyone that bared with us for that ridiculously complex explanation. But hopefully you can see why I wanted to do this webinar, because I feel like we're just starting to really see the impact of this. Depending on your dependency on tracking, your dependency on advertising, this is going to become an issue if we don't head it off sooner rather than later. So with that said, any Q&As? Anybody asking any questions, or were they just totally zoned out?
Everyone was like, "Oh, it makes 100% sense. I understand everything that Kevin said.
Yeah, right.
All the terms, got it."
Yeah, right.
If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A tool. If you put them in the chat, it's hard for me to see them, but if you put them in the Q&A, then I can see them right here on my iPad to manage those. We have several already. Before we answer some questions, I do want to spend just a moment while you're getting these additional questions in. 2 things. One is NEO Summit. I mentioned that at the very beginning. if you want to talk to Kevin in person and actually have him maybe even take a look at some of your setup and help you with some of your analytics, one thing that we have at this summit, we call the live optimization station. We might have a few of them this time around, where you can actually talk with Kevin or other people on our data team and get some insights into your data, your analytics, and even just your campaigns. Not to mention all the incredible speakers that will be there as well. So you can find out more about that at neosummit.com and ihosummit.com. Get your tickets, get them half off if you get them very soon. And then secondly, we have a workshop coming up on Thursday of this week. Oh,
you can have that.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. You're welcome. So generous.
Oh yeah. I could have pressed the button as I knew that's what you wanted.
Well, there's some timing in the slides, so it helps. So we have a workshop coming up on Thursday this week, all about actually Facebook. Not so much on the analytics side of it, but actually diving into how you can use Facebook advertising specifically to build an online donor acquisition campaign and program. So using free content, using Facebook advertising to promote it, building landing pages, building instant donation pages to not just acquire new subscribers, but convert them into donors right away. So we'll spend about 6 hours on Thursday where you can actually get certified in online donor acquisition through this course. Everything, like you saw today, is based on proven and tested principles, real data, not just gut feelings or instincts. You'll have live instructors, you'll have virtual classmates for breakout discussions and Q&A. We'll have live Q&A time like we're going to have here in just a second, and some time to optimize your campaigns live. It's our goal to help you actually walk away with at least the outline of a content offer that you can then start to push on Facebook to start acquiring new donors. You can see the prices on your screen. If you're not a member of the Next After Institute, it's $99. If you're a basic member, it's half off, and if you're a standard member, it's no charge. I'd love for you to join us. Go to nextafter.com/workshop. You can find out more, just to show you kind of what this looks like behind the scenes. This is high quality. You're going to spend time with Brady and myself for about 6 hours in real conversation and live walkthrough through this training. Again, feel free to go to nextafter.com/workshop, learn more, and sign up.
We should take down the Nerf target.
I like the Nerf target. If I had more time, I would have put a little like animated dart. Next time, we have several questions. To start off, there's a question about cookies. And if I understand this question correctly, I think it's one. I think this person is wondering, when the bar pops up on your website, should I accept cookies or not? Does that have any impact on any of what we've been talking about? Like if I choose no, does that affect all of my tracking if a user chooses no?
So if a user chooses no on accepting cookies, and I'm going to come back to why that pop-up exists for a lot of nonprofits too.
Cool.
If they choose no, what that does is it impacts your ability to remarket to them, and it impacts your ability to report on them as a returning visitor next time. Because without that cookie, I don't know that you were this person, and then 90 days later you were this person. So it just shows us it's the same person twice. Google has gone around that. It used to be heavily dependent on it from page to page. Now it uses what's called local storage, which is just, it uses information in your browser to keep track of you on your same session. Now, the reason a lot of times you see those, do you want to accept the cookies prompt, is due to GDPR laws. European laws that require organizations, all organizations, not just nonprofits, to allow people to opt out of tracking, to have their data deleted if they wanted it, to require explicit opt-in for communications. That's why we have a giant checkbox on all of our things, I think, right?
Yep.
Now, it's a European thing, but it protects all European citizens. So technically, if there's somebody from Germany in Idaho and signs up on your nonprofit website, they should be covered by GDPR. I'm not a lawyer. I'm never going to claim to be a lawyer. I do know that they're not necessarily going after small nonprofits in Idaho, so it may not be as earth-shattering of a concern right now, but yeah,
that's helpful.
I'm not a lawyer. I want to reemphasize that is not legal advice.
There were a couple questions about iOS 14. I know we're not going to get into like the depths of that, but two things related to it. One, any expectations as to when those changes will be rolling out?
No, they have not announced it, other than they've said it's imminent.
Okay. So prepare now, and we'll see.
The time is near. Do we want to get into that a little bit? I actually made a single slide with the expectation that I would get a lot of questions. It's my hidden slide.
Well, this is the main question here is with the rollout of iOS 14, do you see it making a significant impact on conversion tracking?
Yes.
Specifically for paid social?
Yes.
Okay.
Heavily.
If there's more questions, maybe we can pull up your slide. So you go, Jimmy. Yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah,
Double yes.
very heavily.
Question from Maggie, and this was towards the beginning of the presentation, about conversion rates for tablet traffic. Is there a particular reason why the average conversion rate is high for tablet users?
So in general, what we normally see is that the tracking for tablet is somewhere in the middle between mobile and desktop. It's harder than to give it on a desktop computer, but easier than the mobile. Gotcha. What we saw on that one, though, was that it was double. Keeping in mind, though, the tracking was for the first half of this year, where we noticed the 20% decrease in tracking for desktop. However, the tablet was not blocking analytics. So my estimate on why tablet was so much higher was that nobody was blocking the tracking. It was a smaller sample size. I would guess the desktop was about the same. So it's really more of a combination of sample size distortion, too small of a sample size to make any real claims of conversion rate. And then two is that they weren't blocking, whereas desktop was missing 25% of its transactions.
Cool. A question from Adam. Adam says, do we have a Google Analytics versus CRM discrepancy for any further back? Like if you're looking back into 2019, any interesting insights there?
I didn't pull it. We can, but based on what we used to see is we would always set up a Google Analytics installation. We'd track it for 3 months to verify it was in line. And we usually saw between the 5 to 10%. I would need to go back way back. The problem you start running into is when you get too old of data, refunds happen and other things or gifts that were in this month got moved to this month, and it starts losing accuracy the further back we get.
That makes sense. Question from Amanda. She put this in the chat and then in the question too. I was wondering, is there any sort of like analytics terminology for dummies type of, book or guide or glossary or anything? Do you have any tools kind of in your back?
Analytics for dummies? No,
that's probably a real book.
No, I guarantee it's a real book. That's a great question. I know we have our own analytics course, which gets into that a little bit.
Yeah.
But nonprofit analytics also gets a little bit different.
Sure.
Short answer, let me check with the team and get back to you on that one. We can do an individual reply on that one.
Great.
I have much smarter people on my team than me that can probably point to some good resources.
Cool. Robert, who's our friend with the analogy about the Trojan horse, says that Google,
thank you for that one, Robert.
Google themselves have some great resources. Robert, if you have a link to something specific, feel free to drop it in the chat. That'd be awesome. Question from Stephanie. If I think Google Analytics undercounting on one of my sites, how do I know that this is the problem? What you've been talking about is the problem, and not just like a improper installation?
There's 2 ways I'd go about that one. It depends on how you have it implemented, but there are plugins in Chrome that do Google Analytics tracking that can tell you, it's actually the old Google Tag Manager, that you can step through your website and see if it's tracking everything it should be tracking. So if you have Tag Manager, you use Preview and you use the Google Tag Manager. If you use just straight Google Analytics implementation, there's I can't remember what it's called, but it's just basically Google Analytics Debugger, I think is what it's called, that it would show you what's being tracked on every single page. You can do that level of step through. The other way to do it is by looking in your audience selection of Google Analytics at the various segments that exist, so device, return versus new, browser type, and look at what's missing. Especially if you have another site you can compare it against. Does this one have a third of the number of IE users than this one? That can help show you as a discrepancy. So those are the 2. Honestly, that's how we do a lot of our debugging. We look to try to figure out what's missing compared to what we know is normal. And we use those debugging tools and just click on everything.
Yeah.
And validate that it's tracking what it should be tracking.
Yeah, that's helpful. Let's see, a question from Maggie asking specifically about appeal and source codes that you were talking about. Wondering, like, how do you actually implement that well? The specific example, she's wondering, would we need to create a separate landing page or donation page with different short codes for every single campaign and every ad and everything like that? Or is there another way to go about it?
There's not, it's hard to answer that with just one. I can tell you that all but one donation platform I've used, and I've used a lot, have a way that you can pass in a source code into your form that overrides the default source code you put into your form. Okay. Most every donation form platform out there has the ability to add a source code. And then usually, like I know with raised donors, you put SC equals and it overrides that source code. For I donate, there's, I think it's also
in the URL.
Yeah, it's in the URL that you can pass it in there. That way you use things like UTM parameters to pass in campaign information. You just add one more piece of information, which is the source code. So my recommendation for you is reach out to your donation form provider and ask them, how can I override this source code value? Like if it's a home built gravity form, if you just put in the URL and name it the same as the field, it overrides it automatically. Most things just kind of build it that way because a lot of people use that functionality.
Yeah, makes sense.
So don't make a single donation form for every single one. That would be a disaster on maintenance. Just override it.
It'd be a lot. A question from Robert. He's wondering if you can talk briefly about GTM 360 and how that fits into all of this. Specifically, he says Classy uses it to tie to our Google Tag Manager account into theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Is 360 affected by this? Are they better off? Are they worse? Is there any difference?
I may get pushback on this one. Google Analytics 360 was really nice for high traffic websites because something that happens with Google Analytics 3, the free version, is that you start getting sampled when you get heavy traffic. It also gives you additional experiments in Google Optimize. It gives you additional parameters and user permissions and Tag Manager. But with the advent and rollout of Google Analytics 4, most of that benefit actually has gone away. You can warehouse your own transaction level, event level data now for free with Google Analytics 4. They don't have the traffic limitations they used to. To Robert's original question though, is it affected? Yes. Because what's happening is it's blocking calls to Google Analytics or GoogleTagManager.com, which whether you're using 360 or not is the same. If you're using the server-side implementation, I don't know Classy's implementation, if they're using a Classy subdomain with server-side, that would be a way to get around it. So that wouldn't be impacted. That makes sense. It really depends.
Cool, thank you. We have 4 more questions. You got
Bring it on.
4 more?
Bring it on.
A question from Anonymous. Let's see. Our nonprofit
their
needs, I get it.
Okay.
Anonymous attendee. That's their full name. Our nonprofit needs to be better at our analytics effort. Our team isn't as tech savvy as Kevin. Yeah. If you are, what do you recommend we do in order to get our efforts up to speed? Any like good starting places? If I'm going to focus on one thing to get a little bit better tracking, what should I do?
The hardest thing to do is go from 0 to 1. And so the first thing, if you're not doing it to get in place, is getting e-commerce implemented on your donation pages, and then using what's called UTM Tracking, which oddly enough stands for Urchin Tracking Mechanism, which is what Google Analytics was 20 years ago before it became Google Analytics. Still stands for something that doesn't exist anymore. But you can use that then to pass in campaigns. Get trained up on how to track your efforts. And then after that, it's about tracking the nuances. But step 1, start tracking.
And most tools at this point make that pretty easy to plug in an ID or something and get it rolling.
Ish.
Okay.
Some are easier than others.
Sure.
Most tools have some level of implementation where you enter your what's called the UAID, which is the Google Analytics ID, into their system and it will track it for you. If it has that, do it. That gets you 90% of the way there. Cool.
And if it doesn't, pray for good customer service.
Reach out to me individually. I'll see what I can do.
A question from Heather. She says, if we lose up to 25% of our information, when an organization tries to optimize their cost per click, should we assume that the ROI is higher than what is being reported by Google or by Facebook?
Yes.
Yes.
Shortest answer is yes on that one. But that's where tracking individual source codes becomes so important. That you can add a source code into your Google Ads links so that you can know in your CRM exactly how much you made off Google Ads. Now, you're going to lose some attribution if they go to your donation page, then to your blog, and then back and give a gift. Sure. Unless you're doing some fancy tracking on that one, but it's still better. Some data is better than none at all, at least for directional level.
Gotcha. Okay, we've got time for two more questions here. A question from Gina. Not our Gina, different Gina. What about a private browser like DuckDuckGo? I know there was a question in the chat about the Brave browser. I don't know a ton about those, other than I know they have enhanced privacy features.
Yep, they block it.
Okay.
They're gone.
There we go.
They're not getting advertised to. You can't remarket to them. You can't track them. Sorry.
All right, and then a question from Charlie. Going back to your suggestion for advanced use of source codes, do you mean using the Google URL builder to create unique UTMs, or is this something additional?
This is in addition to Google's UTMs. UTMs is good, but again, remember, UTMs very rarely get back to your CRM. If I track this campaign using a UTM, it takes a little bit of advanced configuration for my Salesforce, or Razor's Edge, I don't even know if you can, but Salesforce to be able to report on UTM data. So this is using the native CRM functionality, which is appeal codes, which to my knowledge, every CRM has them because they go back to the days of the 1970s of direct mails bonanza, and that was how they tracked those. So that's kind of been maintained. Gotcha. It's not an either or though. It's in addition to in that way.
Gotcha, that's helpful. Okay, one additional
You've
question.
said that like 5 times.
I said 4 and we made it through 4.
That's
Now
great.
there's 2 more, but
Most of these are like no answers. So
and I'm going to try to roll it up in 1. Okay, great. Question more about, like even kind of ethics a little bit around tracking and things.
I am an ethics expert. Bring it on.
If a user has opted out from marketing, they've refused all cookies, should we as an advertiser be able to collect their sessions and their performance metrics? Can you still collect that type of data and use that to feed your marketing? So I guess maybe an example would be if they click to not accept cookies, should there be an implication that we should just like cancel tracking altogether? Any thoughts or?
I'm a big proponent of accepting the wishes of our donors. Is the best way to put it. Someone says, I don't want to hear from you ever again. You send them an email, in all likelihood, it's not going to be a positive response. Now, that's not to say we ignore their gifts. We don't document this, or we pretend their gift never happened and don't put it in our CRM. Maybe you anonymize it if that's a checkbox they click. But I'm a proponent of accepting their wishes. And so if they say, I don't want to be tracked, then there's a ways around it. And usually there's enough other data and people who aren't making those express wishes that we can respect that.
Sure, makes sense. Kevin, this has been awesome. I know for many of you, this is highly technical. Some of you are like really soaking this up. Some of you, this is kind of like first.
I bet most people are glazed over with the level of technical detail.
I know Robert is all in and he's sharing links to some training stuff. So thank you, Robert, for that and kind of having our back here too. That's
all
awesome.
my problem.
He shared UTM Maker. How about that?
There we go.
That's great.
I need to update that, by the way.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your questions. If you have additional questions, feel free to send them to me and I can pass them through Kevin to Nathan@nextafter.com. Again, I'll have a recording for you later this evening. I'll send it out along with the slides and some additional resources, probably some of these links that Robert's dropping in the chat as well. We wish you the best. We're rooting for you. We're hoping that you can find some practical steps forward to keep improving your tracking. Any parting words before we shut down?
Nope.
All right.
That was good. Thank you. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for all the questions.